Henry sat alone on the front porch of his small house, staring at the fading sunlight. The wind rustled the trees, and the scent of damp earth filled the air, but he barely noticed. His mind was somewhere else, somewhere far away, tangled in memories he couldn't seem to escape. He had lived nearly 70 years, yet some days it felt like he had never truly lived at all. There was a time when Henry believed that life was a straight road, leading him exactly where he was meant to go. But now, as he looked back, all he saw were detours, missed turns, and roads he wished he had taken. There was the day he could have said yes to the woman he loved, but he let fear hold him back. The moment he could have stood up for himself. But he chose silence instead. The countless times he could have told his son how proud he was, but the words never seemed to come out right. And now, the past weighed on him like a heavy stone. Henry had always thought that regret was just something people talked about, an emotion that came and went. But as the years passed, he realized regret wasn't just a passing feeling, it was a shadow, following him everywhere. It whispered to him at night. It sat beside him at the dinner table. It made him wonder, had he wasted his life? One evening, after another sleepless night, Henry decided to take a walk down the old dirt path behind his house. He carried a small bag of stones, one for each regret. He had heard of an old ritual, something about leaving behind what no longer served you. So, with hesitant steps, he began his journey. With each mile, he picked up a stone and whispered to it, as if speaking. To the past, I should have been braver. He tossed the stone into the woods. I should have spent more time with my family. Another stone disappearing into the darkness. I should have lived without fear, the heaviest stone of all rolling down the path. But was it really that easy? Could a lifetime of regret be released just like that? This is Henry's story. But in many ways it is also our story. We all carry regrets, some heavier than others. But what if I told you that regret doesn't have to define you? That there is a way to move forward, to let go, and to live the rest of your life without the burden of the past. In the next few minutes, we'll explore 10 powerful ways to overcome regret and step into a life of peace, purpose, and freedom. Because no matter how much time has passed, it's never too late to start again. If this story resonates with you, stay with me. And if you find value in these lessons, consider supporting this journey. Like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Let's walk this path together. Henry had spent years running from his regrets, burying them beneath distractions. Work, television, the occasional drink at the local bar. He convinced himself that if he didn't think about them, they would disappear. But regret doesn't work that way. It lingers, slipping into quiet moments, whispering in the back of the mind when the world grows silent. One afternoon, after yet another restless night, Henry found himself in his attic, searching for an old photograph. As he rummaged through dusty boxes, he stumbled upon an old leather-bound journal, his own, written decades ago. He flipped through the pages, seeing words from a younger version of himself. Dreams, goals, promises. He had forgotten about most of them. Some had come true, many had not. He turned to an entry from 30 years ago. I will not let fear make my choices for me. The handwriting was bold, confident, full of youthful certainty. Henry let out a bitter chuckle. If only I had listened to myself. His fingers trembled as he traced the ink, remembering the moment he wrote those words. He had been on the verge of taking a risk, quitting his job to pursue the passion he had always ignored. But fear won, practicality won, and the life he had dreamed of faded into the background. For the first time in years, Henry allowed himself to sit with his regret instead of pushing it away. He felt the weight of it fully, the ache of what could have been. It hurt, but in that pain, something shifted. He realized that regret only had power over him because he had never truly faced it, so he did something he had never done before. He picked up a pen and wrote a letter, not to anyone else but to himself. I regret not chasing my dreams. I regret not telling the people I loved how much they meant to me. But I refuse to let regret be the final chapter of my story, with E. Each sentence he felt lighter. It wasn't that the regret disappeared, it was still there, but instead of weighing him down, it became something different. a lesson, a guidepost. He couldn't change the past, but he could change the way he carried it. He could accept his regrets, learn from them, and, most importantly, stop letting them define him. As he closed the journal, Henry realized something profound. Regret is not the enemy. Avoiding it is. And the moment we have the courage to face it, we take the first step toward freedom. Henry sat by the lake behind his house, skipping stones across the water, watching the ripples spread and fade. He had done this as a boy, back when life felt limitless, when every mistake could be undone with a simple, "I'll do better next time." But time had a way of moving forward whether he was ready or not. He had spent too many years trapped in the past, replaying old memories like a scratched record, hoping that somehow, if he thought about them enough, he could change the way things had turned out. He closed his eyes and saw her face, Margaret, the woman he had once loved but never had the courage to fight for. He saw the moment she walked away, the hesitation in her step, the silent question in her eyes. "Will you ask me to stay?" He hadn't. He had let fear hold him back, and for years after, he had wondered what might have been. What if he had said something different? What if he had chased after her? The weight of those questions had followed him like a shadow, a burden he had carried for decades. A gust of wind rustled the trees, snapping him back to the present. He watched as a leaf detached from its branch, swirling through the air before, landing on the water. It floated for a moment, then slowly drifted away. That's how time worked, wasn't it? Moments didn't freeze, didn't wait for second chances. They passed, carried by the current of life beyond his reach. For the first time, Henry saw the truth clearly. No matter how much he wished it, the past could not be rewritten. The choices he had made, the words left unspoken, the opportunities missed, they were done. He could hold on to them, replay them endlessly, but it would change nothing. The only thing he had power over was this moment right now. So he did something he had never done before. He whispered into the air, as if speaking to the past itself. "I cannot change you, but I can change how I live from this moment forward." Then, with a deep breath, he picked up a smooth stone and let it slip through his fingers, watching as it sank beneath the water's surface. The ripples spread, then faded. The water was still again. And for the first time in his life, so was he. Henry had always believed that mistakes were failures, that regret was a punishment for making the wrong choices. But as he sat in his quiet living room, flipping through an old photo album, he realized something. Regret wasn't just about loss. It was also about lessons waiting to be understood. He paused at a faded picture of himself and his younger brother, Thomas. They were just boys then, grinning at the camera, arms slung around each other's shoulders. That was before life got in the way, before years of unspoken resentment built walls between them, before the last time they had spoken was not in kindness, but in anger. Henry had spent years regretting that fight, but regret had never brought his brother back. For so long he had asked the wrong question. Why did it have to happen this way? But maybe the real question was, what can I learn from it? He traced his fingers over the photograph, remembering all the ways he had let pride get in the way of love. He had always assumed there would be time to mend things, time to call, time to say I'm sorry. But time had moved forward, and now all he had left were lessons, so he did something different. He picked up the phone and called his son. They had never been particularly close, and Henry had never known how to bridge the distance between them. But he knew now that silence only built regret, and he refused to let history repeat itself. When his son answered, there was hesitation in his voice, surprise, maybe even a little skepticism, but Henry didn't let that stop him. "I just wanted to say that I'm proud of you," he said simply. The words felt unfamiliar, but right. "And I hope we can talk more." There was a pause, and then, "I'd like that." As Henry hung up, he looked back at the photograph of his brother one last time. He couldn't go back and fix the past, but he could carry its lessons forward. He could choose differently now, and maybe, just maybe, that was the real purpose of regret. Not to trap us in what we've lost, but to teach us how to value what we still have. Henry had forgiven many people in his life, friends who had let him down, a boss who had once treated him unfairly, even strangers who had wronged him in small, forgettable ways. But there was one person he had never been able to forgive: himself. He carried the weight of his mistakes like stones in his pocket. The choices he should have made, the words he should have said, the moments he let slip away, all of them clung to him, whispering that he wasn't enough, that he had failed in ways too great to be undone. No one else seemed to judge him as harshly as he judged himself. One evening, Henry found himself in front of an old mirror, the kind that had seen decades of his reflection. He barely recognized the man staring back. His hair had turned silver, lines had deepened around his eyes, but it wasn't age that had worn him down. It was the weight of everything he refused to let go. As he studied his own face, he imagined speaking to the man he used to be, the younger Henry, full of hope but also fear, a man who had made choices based on the only knowledge he had at the time. What would he say to him now? Would he call him a failure? No. He would tell him, "You did the best you could, and that is enough." For the first time, Henry saw his past not as a series of unforgivable mistakes, but as a journey, a life filled with lessons, growth, and moments that had shaped him into who he was. He wasn't perfect, but who was? Holding on to self-blame wasn't noble. It wasn't justice. It was simply a refusal to move forward. So he did something he never thought he would do. He looked into his own eyes and whispered, "I forgive you." The words felt foreign, almost impossible, but as he said them again, something inside him loosened. Forgiving himself didn't erase the past, but it allowed him to step into the present without carrying its weight. It gave him permission to be human, to make peace with himself, to embrace the life he still had ahead. As he turned away from the mirror, he felt lighter. The stones in his pocket were gone, and for the first time in a long time he was free. Henry had spent years convincing himself that he had moved on. That time had dulled the pain, that the bitterness had faded, that the people who had hurt him no longer had power over him. But deep down, he knew the truth. He hadn't forgiven them. He had only buried the wounds, and like roots growing beneath the soil they had spread, wrapping tightly around his heart. There was one wound in particular that refused to heal. Decades ago, his best friend William had betrayed him in a way Henry never expected. It wasn't an obvious kind of betrayal, not a stolen possession, not a spoken insult, but something more subtle, more painful. William had broken a promise, choosing ambition over loyalty, leaving Henry behind when he had needed him most. And though life had moved on, Henry had never truly let it go. One afternoon, while walking through the park, he saw two young boys playing together. One tripped and the other immediately reached out a hand, pulling his friend back to his feet. The simplicity of the moment struck Henry. At what point do we stop forgiving so easily? When do we start carrying our wounds instead of healing them? That night, Henry sat at his desk staring at a blank piece of paper. He hadn't spoken to William in years. He didn't even know if the man still lived in the same town. But something inside him told him it didn't matter. This wasn't about William, it was about him. He picked up his pen and began to write. "William, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. For too long I've let anger and disappointment sit in my heart like an unwelcome guest. I've replayed the past over and over as if doing so would change it. But I'm tired, my friend. I'm tired of carrying this weight. I want to remember the good we had, not just how it ended. So today, I choose to forgive. Not because you asked, not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." As he signed his name, he felt something shift inside him. He didn't need a response, he didn't need an apology. He had spent years waiting for something outside of himself to bring closure, but he realized now that forgiveness wasn't for William, it was for him. And as he folded the letter and set it aside, Henry understood. True freedom isn't found in holding on, it's found in letting go. Henry had spent most of his life either looking back or looking ahead, dwelling on what had been or worrying about what was to come. He rarely thought about the present, as if the moment in front of him was merely a bridge between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's uncertainties. But as he grew older, he realized something unsettling. He had lived decades, yet he had barely been there for any of it. One morning, after another night of restless thoughts, Henry decided to take a walk, without a destination. He left his watch at home, turned off his phone and stepped outside with no plan other than to notice the world around him. At first, his mind resisted. As he walked, thoughts flooded in, unfinished conversations, old mistakes, things he wished he had done differently. But then something shifted. A crisp breeze brushed against his skin. A bird called from a nearby tree. The smell of damp earth after last night's rain filled the air. Henry stopped walking. He closed his eyes and simply breathed. For the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. He was here, in this moment. And it was enough. He opened his eyes and saw an elderly woman sitting on a bench, tossing breadcrumbs to a group of pigeons. She smiled at him, as if she knew something he didn't. "They don't worry about the past," she said, nodding toward the birds. "They just eat when they're hungry, fly when they need to, and rest when they're tired," Henry chuckled. "Sounds simple." "It is," she said, "if we let it be." That evening, Henry made a promise to himself. Not a grand declaration, not an overwhelming goal, but something small, something real. Every day he would take 10 minutes just to be. Whether it was sipping his morning coffee without distraction, watching the sunset without thinking about tomorrow, or simply feeling his breath move in and out, he would remind himself that this moment is all there ever truly is. As the days passed, something remarkable happened. The weight of the past loosened. The fear of the future softened. He found joy in the smallest things, the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of laughter from children playing nearby, the way the wind carried the scent of blooming jasmine through his window. For so long, Henry had chased happiness as if it was something to be found in a distant future. But now he understood. Happiness wasn't ahead of him, it wasn't behind him, it was right here, in the quiet beauty of now. Henry had long believed that some mistakes were beyond repair. That time had closed certain doors, locking him out of second chances. But as he sat alone in his dimly lit kitchen, staring at an old yellowed birthday card he had never sent, he wondered, was it truly too late? The card was for his son, David. It had been sitting in the back of a drawer for years, unsent, unread. Henry had written it on David's 30th birthday, back when pride and stubbornness had kept them apart. They had fought over something small that had grown into something big, too big for either of them to back down. Henry had meant to send the card. He had meant to pick up the phone, but he kept waiting for David to reach out first. Days turned into months, months into years, and silence became their only form of communication. Now, as he traced the edges of the unopened envelope, regret settled heavily in his chest. He had told himself that the past couldn't be changed, that some wounds never healed. But what if he was wrong? What if the only thing keeping the door closed was his own unwillingness to knock? The next morning, Henry found himself outside, a small bakery, David's favorite as a child. He remembered how his son's face would light up at the sight of fresh cinnamon rolls. Without thinking, he bought a dozen and drove across town, heart pounding with every mile. When he arrived at David's doorstep, he hesitated. What if his son didn't want to see him? What if too much time had passed? But then he remembered something important. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about showing up now. Taking a deep breath, he knocked. The door opened, and there was David, older now, cautious, but not unkind. There was a long silence before Henry held up the box of cinnamon rolls and said, "I know this doesn't fix everything, but I thought maybe we could start with breakfast." David stared at him, then at the box in his hands. And then, to Henry's surprise, a small, almost hesitant smile appeared. As they sat together at the kitchen table, years of unspoken words slowly unraveled into conversation. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't immediate, but it was something. And Henry realized that sometimes the greatest act of redemption isn't rewriting the past, it's having the courage to begin again. Henry had spent a lifetime holding on to old wounds, past mistakes, and the heavy weight of what could have been. He carried these burdens the way a traveler carries an overstuffed suitcase, unwilling to let go of even the things that no longer served him. But lately he had begun to wonder, what if the weight he carried wasn't meant to be held forever? One autumn afternoon, he visited the river near his childhood home. It was a place he had often gone to think, to escape, to breathe. The water moved steadily, indifferent to the past, carrying leaves and fallen branches downstream without hesitation. As he stood by the riverbank, he picked up a smooth stone, turning it over in his palm. In its weight, he felt every regret, every disappointment, every harsh word he had ever spoken or received. For years he had believed that holding on to his pain somehow made it meaningful, that releasing it would mean forgetting, erasing, or dismissing what had happened. But as he watched the river flow, he realized that letting go wasn't about forgetting. It was about making space for something new. He closed his eyes and whispered the words he had been too afraid to say before. I release you. I release the pain, the resentment, the need for things to have been different. I release the past so that I may live fully in the present. With that, he let the stone slip from his fingers. It hit the water with a quiet splash, disappearing beneath the surface. The ripples spread outward, then faded, until the river was smooth again, as if it had never been disturbed. For the first time in years, Henry felt lighter. He had always thought that letting go was about loss, but now he understood. It was about freedom. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to define him. As he walked away from the river, he felt something unfamiliar: peace. Not because his life had been perfect, but because he had finally given himself permission to move forward. The river kept flowing, and now so would he. Henry had always been the kind of man who believed in handling things on his own. He had been raised to think that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that real strength meant carrying your burdens in silence. So, for most of his life, that's exactly what he did. When his marriage fell apart, he told himself to move on. When his best friend passed away, he grieved alone. When regrets gnawed at him late at night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling, never speaking a word of it to anyone. But silence had its own weight, and over the years it had pressed down on him, slowly, steadily, until it became almost unbearable. He hadn't realized how heavy it all was until one afternoon when he found himself in the middle of the grocery store, unable to decide between two brands of coffee. It was such a small thing, trivial even, but in that moment the exhaustion of carrying everything alone caught up to him. He gripped the cart handle, his breath shallow, his chest tight. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, frozen in place, but an elderly woman beside him gently touched his arm. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, her voice full of kindness. It had been years since anyone had asked him that, and longer still since he had answered honestly. He wanted to nod, to brush it off with a polite smile, but something in him cracked. His throat tightened, and before he could stop himself, he whispered, "I don't know." The woman didn't pry. She simply gave his arm a reassuring squeeze and said, "Sometimes we're not meant to carry things alone." That night, Henry did something he had never done before. He called an old friend, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. When the familiar voice answered, he hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he said, "I think I need someone to talk to." What followed wasn't a grand revelation, but a simple conversation, about life, about aging, about regrets and hopes and everything in between. And when Henry hung up the phone, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: relief. He realized that strength wasn't about enduring pain in silence. Strength was in knowing when to reach out, when to let someone else help carry the weight. Because no matter how strong a person is, no one is meant to walk this journey alone. Henry had spent years looking backward, lost in the weight of old regrets. But one morning, as he sat by his window watching the sunrise, a thought struck him with startling clarity. If he kept living this way, the greatest regret of all would be the time he was wasting right now. He had spent so much of his life dwelling on what he should have done that he had forgotten the most important truth. The only time he could still change was the time he had left. The past was set in stone, but the future was still unwritten, and if he wanted to live without new regrets, he had to start making different choices, now. That day, Henry made a decision. He took out a notebook and wrote at the top of the page, "What do I want to do with the time I have left?" It wasn't about grand achievements or impossible dreams. It was about meaning, about waking up each day with purpose, about making choices he wouldn't look back on with regret. One of the first things he wrote was simple: "Tell people I love them." It seemed obvious, but how many times had he assumed people just knew? He picked up the phone and called his sister, someone he hadn't spoken to in far too long. When she answered, he didn't dance around his words. "I just wanted to say, I love you," he told her. There was a pause, then a soft laugh. "Well, it's about time," she said. The next thing he wrote, "Do something I always wanted to do." He had spent years saying he wished he had learned how to paint, so instead of just thinking about it, he signed up for a class. When he dipped his brush into paint for the first time in decades, something inside him woke up. It wasn't about talent or perfection, it was about joy. Lastly, he wrote, "Live each day as if it matters, because it does." That meant slowing down, savoring his morning coffee instead of rushing through it, watching the sunset instead of watching the news, laughing without hesitation, saying yes to small adventures. As Henry closed his notebook, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, not relief for the past, but excitement for the future, because he finally understood that a life without regret isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about living today in a way that when he looked back years from now, he could smile and say, "I lived fully. I was here." Henry sat on the old wooden bench in his backyard, the evening sky painted in soft hues of orange and lavender. The world felt quiet, but for the first time in years, the silence wasn't heavy. It wasn't filled with regret or unspoken words. It was peaceful. It was his. He thought about the journey that had led him here, not just the years of mistakes and missed chances, but the lessons, the forgiveness, the moments of courage that had allowed him to finally let go. He had spent a lifetime believing that regret was a burden he had no choice but to carry. But now he understood the truth. Regret was never meant to imprison him. It was meant to teach him. And once he had learned, it was time to set it down and walk forward. He had faced his past, accepted what could not be changed, and found the wisdom in his mistakes. He had forgiven others, not because they had asked, but because he deserved peace. He had learned that the weight of regret was nothing compared to the lightness of letting go. Most importantly, Henry had stopped waiting for life to come to him, so he had chosen to live now, to wake up each morning with intention, to do the things that mattered, to love the people around him without hesitation. He had made peace with what had been, so he could embrace what was. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs, and smiled. Not because life had been perfect, not because every wound had healed, but because he had finally given himself permission to be free. So what about you? We all carry regrets, some small, some that weigh on us like mountains. But no matter how heavy they feel, they do not have to define us. They do not have to be the final chapter of our story. Maybe today is the day you face the past without fear. Maybe today is the day you forgive, not just others, but yourself. Maybe today is the day you choose to stop waiting and start living. Because no matter how many years have passed, no matter what has been lost, you are still here. And as long as you are here, it is never too late to begin again. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of something in your own life, take a moment to reflect. And if you found value in this journey, consider supporting this channel. Like, comment, and subscribe. Let's walk this path together, with open hearts, with purpose, and most of all, with peace.